What if the smallest act of kindness, a trembling puppy left on a stormy doorstep, could help a broken family find hope again? For the Hayes family, the storm wasn't just outside. Inside, grief and fear threatened to swallow them whole after their baby boy, Max, was left paralyzed. Then, one rainy morning, a shivering golden retriever pup appeared on their porch, abandoned, lost, and needing a miracle as much as they did. No one could have guessed how much that little dog would change their lives, or an entire neighborhood. If you believe in second chances and the power of compassion, give this video a like. And if you want more real stories where love makes the impossible possible, hit subscribe and join our community. Stay with us, because sometimes hope arrives when you least expect it, and in the smallest, softest ways. No one remembered a storm like this one. At St. Luke's Community Hospital in Dayton, Ohio, thunder rattled the old window panes, and rain hammered the glass so hard it seemed determined to get inside. The night shift nurses peered out through gray sheets of water, anxious. But inside room 217, the real tempest raged in the hearts of Ben and Olivia Hayes. Ben stood motionless by the door, shoulders slumped and clothes soaked from his desperate sprint inside. He barely noticed the drip of water from his hair onto the scuffed tile floor. Everything felt muted, distant, as if he was underwater. Behind him, the corridor echoed with the hurried footsteps of doctors and nurses, each sound an intrusion. But here, in this moment, the only thing Ben could hear was the broken, mechanical gasp of the incubator. Olivia was curled in the hard plastic chair, knees pressed to her chest, arms wrapped tight around her body. She hadn't spoken in an hour, maybe 2. Not since the doctor came in, face pinched with worry, words precise and merciless. "Your son has suffered a spinal cord injury. He is paralyzed from the waist down." The words landed like blows. Paralyzed. No guarantees. No simple future, only pain and uncertainty. Max, so tiny, impossibly small, lay in the plexiglass crib, his chest rising and falling with a gentle, irregular rhythm. The machines crowded around him beeped and blinked in a language only nurses seemed to understand. His skin was almost translucent. His legs didn't move, not even when Olivia brushed her finger along his foot. The room was heavy with grief, too dense to breathe. Ben watched his wife, desperate to do something, anything, but every gesture felt hollow. He tried to reach for her, to find the right words, but nothing came. The world outside was chaos. Trees bent sideways by wind, lightning cracking the sky, sirens in the distance. But inside, the storm was silent, a dull ache of disbelief and helplessness. Suddenly, a burst of cold air swept in as the door opened. Ben's mother, Margaret, stepped inside, hair plastered to her forehead, raincoat dripping. She hurried to Olivia's side, setting down a battered overnight bag. Margaret's presence brought a flicker of warmth, but even she seemed lost, her hands shaking as she clutched Olivia's arm. "We're here, honey. We're right here," she whispered, her own voice quivering. But she couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the hallway. In the brief glare, Margaret caught a glimpse of her son, Ben, always steady, always reliable, reduced to someone hollowed out. She wanted to comfort him, to remind him of every hard thing they'd ever survived. But she felt powerless. All the wisdom, all the strength she'd gathered through years of single motherhood felt useless in the face of this agony. The minutes crawled by. The hospital, built to withstand tornadoes, seemed to groan under the weight of the storm. Power flickered. The nurses checked and rechecked every monitor. In a lull, Olivia finally spoke, voice so thin it was almost a sigh. "Why him?" Ben had no answer. The question hung in the air, echoing off the sterile walls. Max's prognosis was delivered with the blunt honesty of science. There would be surgeries, endless therapy, a childhood spent in and out of waiting rooms. The doctors explained nerve damage, rehabilitation, the uncertain possibility of improvement. But nothing could erase the single, unspoken fear that had already taken root in their hearts. What if hope was only a word? Margaret sat by Max's crib, humming softly. Her song was half lullaby, half prayer, fragments of old hymns and nursery rhymes. "You're stronger than you know, little one," she whispered, hoping some part of Max could hear, could feel the love trying to reach him across the void. Thunder shook the building again. Somewhere down the hall, a code blue alarm sounded. Ben stood and walked into the corridor, the storm wind seeping through the cracks in the old windows. He pressed his forehead to the glass, letting the cold sting clear his mind. In the distance, the storm seemed endless, the sky a wild ocean of black and silver. He remembered the day Olivia told him she was pregnant, the trembling excitement, the endless possibilities. They had painted the nursery pale yellow, argued over names, counted kicks. Now, in this storm-battered hospital, those dreams seemed as fragile as the petals of a flower pressed between book pages. Margaret reached for Ben's hand, squeezing it hard. "We don't know what will happen, but we'll get through it. All of us." Ben nodded, but couldn't speak. He felt adrift, caught between grief and a stubborn, flickering hope he was afraid to name. As the night wore on, nurses rotated in and out, faces tight with concern. The wind howled. Max slept, or seemed to, unmoving except for the faintest flutter of his eyelids. The family sat in silence, each alone in their sorrow, but bound together by a love that endured even this storm. In the early hours, as the sky turned from pitch black to bruised gray, Margaret whispered, "Look." Through the window, the rain slowed, the thunder faded. But inside room 217, the tempest still churned, unresolved, as the first uncertain rays of dawn stretched across the city. No one could know, not yet, that hope was waiting for them. Small, shivering, with golden fur and a story of her own. For now, all they knew was the storm, and the fragile faith that they would find a way through, together. The storm finally broke with the sunrise. Maple Lane glistened beneath puddles and scattered branches. In the hush after the chaos, the Hayes family's house felt too quiet, like even the walls held their breath, afraid of disturbing the fragile new reality inside. Ben and Olivia returned from the hospital, exhausted and hollow-eyed. The therapy brochures, still unopened, lay scattered on the kitchen counter next to bottles of antiseptic and a pair of baby booties Olivia had chosen months before. The silence pressed in on Margaret, who'd volunteered to stay overnight at the house to keep things in order. Even the refrigerator seemed to hum more softly, as if mourning. A flash of movement at the window caught Margaret's eye. The morning was gray, heavy with leftover drizzle. She stepped onto the porch, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders, and paused. There, in the center of the welcome mat, sat a cardboard box, battered, waterlogged, and caved in at one corner. Rain dripped from the gutters above, spattering the faded "Home Sweet Home" lettering at her feet. At first, Margaret thought it was just another delivery ruined by the storm. But then a faint, pitiful whimper rose from the box. She crouched down, heart pounding, and peeled back the soggy flap. Two enormous brown eyes stared up at her, terrified, pleading. Nestled inside, shivering and soaked to the skin, was a golden retriever puppy. Her fur was a matted mess, tail curled protectively around her tiny body. For a moment, Margaret was paralyzed. She looked up and down the empty street. No one was in sight. No cars passing. Only the soft drip of rain from bare branches. Who would leave a helpless puppy on a stormy night? Margaret's first instinct was frustration. Another burden, another responsibility, when the family was already stretched to the breaking point. But as she reached into the box, the puppy pressed into her palm, desperate for warmth. She carried the box inside, shoes squeaking on the tile. Olivia and Ben emerged from the hallway, drawn by the strange new sound. Olivia stared in disbelief, her mouth working silently before she managed a whisper. Where did she come from? Ben ran his hand through his hair, eyes flicking from Margaret to the puppy and back, as if searching for some hidden explanation. Margaret shrugged, forcing a wry smile. I found her outside. Someone must have abandoned her during the storm. She set the box on the kitchen floor. The puppy tried to stand, wobbled, then slumped back into a trembling heap. She looked so lost, so completely overwhelmed by the world. Olivia hesitated, torn between compassion and exhaustion. We can't keep her. Can we? Her voice was brittle, already bracing for another disappointment. Ben frowned, wrestling with the same question. The family could barely manage their own crisis, let alone take on a needy animal. But before anyone could speak again, a soft sound drifted down the hallway, the faint, uncertain cry of Max. It was the first noise he'd made since coming home. Margaret went to him, the puppy cradled in her arms. Max lay in his crib, eyes glazed and unfocused, a line of drool slipping down his cheek. For days he'd barely responded to touch, to light, to the gentle coaxing of his parents' voices. Margaret bent over the crib, holding the puppy so Max could see. Look, sweetheart, she murmured. Someone else had a rough night too. What happened next was so subtle, at first it seemed like a trick of the light. Max turned his head, just slightly, toward the puppy. His gaze, dull and distant, sharpened for an instant. The puppy whimpered again, reaching out her nose. For the first time since the accident, Max's eyes tracked a moving thing. Margaret gasped. Olivia clapped a hand to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Even Ben, stoic, guarded, felt something shift inside his chest. The puppy inched closer, sniffing the edge of the crib. She wagged her tail weakly, a low, hopeful thump. Max's fingers twitched, just a flicker, but enough to send a bolt of hope through Margaret's heart. Did you see that? She whispered fiercely. Ben and Olivia stared, transfixed, afraid to speak and break the spell. They debated what to do next. Was it safe to keep the puppy? Could they manage another life, even a small one, amid so much uncertainty? But no one could bring themselves to turn her away. The puppy, named Rosie within the hour after Olivia's grandmother, seemed to sense her place. She curled up beside Max's crib, her eyes never leaving the little boy's face. That night, Margaret lay awake, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. Was it a coincidence or something more? She didn't know, but she felt a strange intuition, a stirring of hope she hadn't let herself feel in weeks. As darkness settled again over Maple Lane, the family hovered between fear and wonder. They watched Rosie sleep, her chest rising and falling in time with Max's. Outside, the last raindrops clung to the windows, but inside, something had shifted, just a little. The silence was still there, but it wasn't empty anymore. It held the spark of a new beginning. Margaret sat up late, sipping cold tea at the kitchen table, listening to the house breathe. She caught herself humming again, the same half-prayer as before. For the first time since the storm, she let herself imagine that miracles, however small, however unlikely, could find their way to Maple Lane too. Days blurred together, stitched by the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the window and the distant, muffled sounds of life continuing outside. Inside the Hayes home, time seemed suspended, a place between heartbreak and something that might, one day, resemble healing. Rosie, the golden puppy, made herself small and careful at first. She seemed to sense the weight of sorrow in the air and rarely left Max's side. The crate Margaret had lined with old towels in the living room went mostly unused. Rosie preferred to lie on the soft rug under Max's crib, pressing herself against the wooden slats as close to the baby as she could possibly get. When the family gathered, she'd look up with those wide, searching eyes, ears perked for the tiniest whimper from Max. Max, still so fragile, still unmoving from the waist down, became Rosie's world. Where he was, she wanted to be. In the pale morning light, Margaret would find Rosie curled up just beneath the crib, tail thumping quietly as if to remind everyone she was there, steadfast and unafraid. Olivia and Ben went through the motions each day, their faces set and voices subdued. Olivia filled bottles, measured medication, and kept charts for therapists and doctors, but her smiles were rare, reserved for moments when she thought no one was watching. Ben threw himself into chores, fixing the leaky sink, raking storm debris from the yard, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind off the ache inside his chest. It was Margaret who noticed the subtle change first. On a gray afternoon, as rain traced rivers down the window panes, Rosie nosed a small, bright red toy block across the carpet, nudging it in slow, determined movements. The block bumped against one of Max's hands, and Rosie nudged it again, more insistent this time. Max's eyes fluttered, focusing with surprising clarity on Rosie's wagging tail. His lips parted, as if he wanted to laugh or call out, but all that came was a soft sigh. Then, incredibly, one of his fingers twitched, ever so slightly, brushing the block. Margaret gasped. Was it real? She blinked, heart pounding, afraid to hope. Rosie simply sat back, tail brushing the floor, waiting for Max to notice her again. Margaret began keeping a mental tally of these small moments. The way Max's gaze followed Rosie when she darted through a sunbeam, the flutter of his hand when Rosie rested her chin beside his pillow, the glimmer of recognition, no matter how faint, each time Rosie pressed her nose to his cheek. Every small connection was a thread tying Max back to the world around him. Rosie's presence worked a quiet magic throughout the house. There were still days when grief hung heavy, when Olivia retreated behind closed doors and Ben disappeared into the garage for hours. But Rosie was persistent, spreading her gentle energy in ways no one could ignore. When Margaret wept quietly at the kitchen table, Rosie would nuzzle her knee until she looked up, then sit patiently, waiting for a soft hand or a kind word. When Olivia finally let herself hold Max and sob into his blanket, Rosie climbed into her lap, a warm, wriggling anchor in the middle of the storm. As the week unfolded, Max's therapists came and went, their words a careful blend of optimism and caution. Any movement, any sign of awareness is progress, one said, watching as Rosie sat perfectly still beside Max's playmat, head cocked with curiosity. Don't underestimate the value of companionship. For Margaret, those words felt like an affirmation of what she already sensed. Rosie was doing more than anyone realized. She wasn't just comforting. She was connecting, showing Max the world could still offer warmth, love, and even play, despite the pain. One night, thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing the memory of the hospital storm. Margaret wandered the dark hallway, her mind crowded with what-ifs and worries. She paused outside Max's room, watching Rosie and Max through a crack in the door. Rosie was curled beside the crib, breathing in tandem with Max. In the faint glow of the nightlight, it almost looked as if Rosie was keeping watch, standing guard against every shadow. The next morning, Olivia found Max's hand tangled in Rosie's fur, the puppy fast asleep and utterly at peace. She snapped a picture, hands trembling, and sent it to Ben at work. For the first time in weeks, she added a short, hopeful note. He moved his fingers again. She was there. The family started talking, just a little more honestly. They spoke about Rosie and what she might be to Max, a friend, a guardian, a small miracle in a house desperate for one. Margaret allowed herself to hope, quietly at first, then with growing conviction. She'd catch herself humming those old lullabies, sometimes joined by Olivia's quiet singing. The house, once silent and heavy, began to breathe again, the air a little lighter each day. But it wasn't only the family who noticed the change. Neighbors walking their dogs would pause at the edge of the yard, peering through the windows to catch a glimpse of the golden puppy and the silent, watchful baby. The mail carrier left an extra dog treat in the box. A note scrawled on the bag, "For your new friend." Margaret knew they weren't out of the woods yet. Max still faced a mountain of challenges: doctor's appointments, therapy sessions, hard days and harder nights. But with Rosie by his side, every small step felt possible. The sadness lingered, but it was pierced by the warmth of new beginnings, by the gentle certainty that hope had come into their home, not as a miracle of thunder and lightning, but as a soft golden light that refused to go out. Rosie, Margaret realized, had become quietly essential. Her companionship not just comfort, but lifeline, threading through every room, every moment. She sat by the crib that night, watching Max and Rosie sleep, and whispered, "Thank you, little one. Thank you for staying." For the first time since the storm, she believed the darkness might one day give way to dawn. Spring settled over Dayton in fits and starts. Days of unexpected warmth, followed by cold snaps that left ice on the porch steps and Margaret's joints aching. The house on Maple Lane reflected that same unpredictability. Some days, the light through the curtains made everything seem possible, and laughter, shaky but real, floated down the hall. Other days, the sorrow pressed back, gray and heavy, making each step, each small effort, feel monumental. Rosie, the golden puppy, moved through it all with a kind of quiet wisdom no one could explain. She mirrored the moods of the family, tail wagging with bright, silly energy when things were good, then growing subdued, almost solemn, on the harder days. Sometimes she'd bring a toy and drop it in Ben's lap, encouraging him to break his silence. Other times she'd curl up beside Olivia on the couch, pressing close without making a sound. Just a gentle warmth against all that pain. Max, still paralyzed from the waist down, seemed more awake now, more present, somehow, in the world around him. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. His eyes followed Rosie's every move, tracking her across the room. He would reach out with his arms, his fingers brushing her fur or the soft rattle Margaret placed just out of easy reach. Rosie, as if sensing what Max needed, would gently nudge the toy closer, nose soft and insistent, showing patience as he fumbled to grab it. One afternoon, Margaret watched this small ritual unfold, Rosie pushing a squeaky blue elephant again and again toward Max's open hand. Every time Max tried and failed to grab it, Rosie simply retrieved it and nudged it closer, never frustrated, never bored. At last, Max's hand closed clumsily around the elephant's ear. The look of triumph on his face, a flicker of a smile, a spark of recognition, nearly undid Margaret. She blinked away tears and whispered a quiet, "Thank you," into the stillness. For Margaret, these moments brought back a flood of memories she'd buried deep. She remembered raising Ben alone after his father's accident, the long nights filled with doubt and fear, the endless grind of working two jobs while trying to be both mother and father. She'd survived on stubbornness and love, refusing to let the darkness win. But now, watching her son's family hurt in ways she couldn't fix, Margaret felt the full weight of old wounds and knew. She wanted to believe everything would turn out all right, but some days that hope felt thin as tissue. Rosie, it seemed, understood even this unspoken pain. On the worst days, when Margaret's hands shook too much to sew or write in her journal, Rosie would settle at her feet, head in her lap, heartbeat steady as a drum. It wasn't a cure, but it was enough to keep Margaret anchored, if only for a little while. Therapy sessions for Max continued, a parade of specialists in brightly colored scrubs with cheerful voices and endless patience. They charted every tiny movement, every flicker of attention. Most days were hard, filled with tears and frustration. Progress came slow, so slow that hope sometimes seemed to stall out entirely. Olivia grew anxious, afraid to believe in improvement, afraid to trust that Rosie's presence could really mean anything. Ben tried to stay strong for his family, but the cracks showed when he thought no one was looking. But then, a new therapist, a young woman named Kendra with warm brown eyes, arrived for an afternoon session. She sat on the floor beside Max, letting Rosie sniff her hand before turning her attention to the little boy. Kendra noticed things others missed, the way Max's eyes brightened when Rosie entered the room, how he reached more eagerly for toys when Rosie was nearby. She started incorporating Rosie into therapy, encouraging play and interaction. "That's not just comfort," Kendra observed quietly to Margaret. "That's motivation. That's partnership. I think Rosie's helping more than we realize." The family began to see it too. Rosie would model movement for Max, rolling a ball across the rug, then nudging it gently until he reached for it. She'd bark softly when Max succeeded, a joyful, musical sound that made everyone smile. Max, for his part, grew more responsive, arms waving, fingers stretching, eyes shining with determination. Even on days when his legs refused to cooperate, he seemed more engaged, more alive. Late one night, Margaret sat in her chair by the window, rain tapping at the glass. She thought about everything she'd learned, about pain, about perseverance, about the ways people could break and mend again and again. She watched Rosie, sleeping at Max's crib, and realized that the healing in this house wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, persistent, like the roots of a tree growing deeper in the earth, unseen but unstoppable. Ben joined her, sitting silently for a long time before finally speaking. "I keep thinking I have to be strong, Mom, but some days I feel like I'm falling apart." Margaret put her hand on his. "You don't have to be strong all the time. You just have to keep showing up. Rosie taught me that." He nodded, eyes glassy with unshed tears, and for a moment, the distance between them vanished. That week, Max surprised everyone by laughing for the first time since coming home, a bright, gurgling sound, as Rosie licked his cheek and the sun poured through the window. Olivia cried, Ben hugged them both, and Margaret thanked every power she believed in for giving them this day. Rosie kept on, gentle and persistent, modeling patience, hope, and the healing power of simple presence. Each small victory, each smile, each touch, each shared glance was a reminder that strength could be quiet, and healing could come not just from medicine, but from love that never gives up. Darkness came early that night, pressing close against the windows of the Hayes home. A new storm swept in, rattling the gutters and casting wild shadows across the nursery walls. Inside, the house felt uneasy, as if it too was bracing for something to go wrong. Margaret tucked Max into his crib, humming quietly, her heart heavy with the worries she carried. Rosie curled up as always beneath the crib, her golden fur a bright spot in the gloom. Ben and Olivia were in the kitchen, voices low and tired as they washed up after dinner. Even their laughter sounded fragile. Olivia paused, looking down the hall toward Max's room, anxiety written in the set of her jaw. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" she whispered. Ben wiped his hands, unsure what to say. The question was always the same, always impossible. Is love enough? Is hope enough? Outside, the wind rose, branches scraping at the windows. In the nursery, a draft snuck in around the sill and Rosie pricked her ears, unsettled. Max was restless, shifting from side to side, hands exploring the bars of his crib. Rosie watched, tail flicking uneasily, sensing the tension that seemed to pulse through the air. The minutes ticked by. Margaret, exhausted, dozed off in the armchair, her book sliding onto the floor. Rain hammered the roof, thunder rumbling in the distance. The baby monitor in the living room crackled, static mixing with the sounds of Max's gentle breathing. Then, sudden movement. Max, dreaming or confused, rolled too close to the edge of his crib, his body slumping forward. The rails, usually his safety, now offered little protection. His arms flailed, his head lolled dangerously over the side. In the half-light, it all happened in seconds. Rosie's bark cut through the night, a high, frantic warning that jolted Margaret awake. She snapped upright, eyes wide, instantly alert. The urgency in Rosie's voice was unmistakable, desperate. Margaret sprang up, feet tangling in the blanket, and rushed to the crib. What she saw made her heart stop. Max's small body teetered precariously, one arm already slipping through the rails. In that split second, Rosie hurled herself forward, wedging her body between Max and the edge. With surprising strength and precision, she nudged him back, using her head and shoulders to keep him from tumbling out. Max's body slid safely onto the mattress as Margaret grabbed his legs, pulling him back to safety. Olivia and Ben, hearing Rosie's barking and Margaret's shout, sprinted down the hall. The scene they found was chaos. Margaret breathless and pale, Rosie whining anxiously, Max red-faced but safe. Olivia swept Max into her arms, holding him tight, tears streaming down her cheeks as she pressed her face into his hair. Ben sank onto the floor, hands shaking, relief washing over him in waves. They replayed the moment again and again. What could have happened? How close they'd come to disaster. How Rosie had saved their son's life. That night, Ben pulled the baby monitor's footage onto his laptop. He, Margaret, and Olivia watched, hearts in their throats, as the camera captured everything. Max's slow, dangerous tumble, Rosie's sudden alertness, and her selfless act to keep him safe. There was no question. Rosie had acted with intention, with understanding that seemed almost human. Margaret's voice trembled as she spoke. She knew. She really knew what to do. Ben nodded, wiping his eyes. We owe her everything. Olivia didn't sleep that night. She lay on the couch, Max bundled against her chest, Rosie curled protectively at their feet. Every time Olivia closed her eyes, she saw the image of Max, inches from disaster. Every time she opened them, she saw Rosie, steadfast and watchful, refusing to leave his side. The next morning dawned with a fragile quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world rinsed clean. But inside, the family was changed. Margaret brewed coffee in the still dark kitchen, her hands steady now, her mind replaying the moment over and over. She found Rosie by the back door, looking up at her with those soulful eyes, tail sweeping the floor. Margaret knelt down, wrapping her arms around the puppy, pressing her cheek to soft fur. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for keeping him safe." Olivia and Ben spent the morning reinforcing the crib, making sure nothing like that could happen again. But they both knew the truth. It was Rosie's courage, her love for Max, that had truly protected him. As the day unfolded, small miracles continued. Max seemed different, more present. During a quiet moment, as sunlight spilled through the window, Olivia noticed Max's toes twitch. Just a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but there. She called Ben and Margaret, her voice trembling with hope. Together they watched, barely breathing, as Max's foot moved again, a tiny, undeniable breakthrough. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, her heart swelling with gratitude. "He's coming back to us," she murmured, her hand clutching Ben's. Rosie wagged her tail, pressing close to Max, as if sensing she'd helped unlock something precious. Word of Rosie's heroic act spread quickly among friends and neighbors. The mail carrier asked after the miracle dog. The therapist, reviewing the baby monitor footage, smiled in astonishment. "She's more than a pet," he said quietly. "She's his guardian angel." That night, as the family sat together in the warm glow of the living room, Ben looked at Rosie, her head resting on Max's blanket, eyes half closed, and realized that their journey, for all its heartbreak, had given them something extraordinary. Rosie had brought them not just hope, but the proof that even at the edge of disaster, love could reach across every divide, lighting the way back from the darkest places. Outside, the storm clouds faded, leaving only the soft promise of a better tomorrow. And for the first time since that terrible night in the hospital, the Hayes family allowed themselves to believe in miracles again. The days following Rosie's heroic rescue felt lighter, as if someone had thrown open all the windows and let hope come rushing in. For the first time in weeks, Ben, Olivia, and Margaret moved through their routines with new energy, buoyed by the memory of Rosie's swift intervention and the miracle of Max's twitching toes. Word of Rosie's heroism spread, and neighbors dropped by with cookies and homemade thank you cards, their curiosity mingled with awe and genuine warmth. Ben took the lead in making the house safer. He anchored the crib and adjusted every corner of the nursery, determined never to let danger come so close again. Olivia spent her days with Max and Rosie, documenting each small sign of progress, each laugh and cry, and every new way Max responded to his golden-furred friend. Margaret, too, found herself smiling more, humming the old lullabies that had comforted generations of her family. Therapy became the family's central focus. The sessions grew longer and more intense, as if the family's faith in miracles had opened the door to hard work. Rosie was at Max's side for every session, her presence both calming and motivating. Max's fingers clung to her fur as therapists encouraged him to stretch, to reach, to try again and again. Sometimes Rosie would fetch a toy and drop it in his lap, and Max, with a determined grunt, would reach for it. The family marveled at how Rosie's patience coaxed effort from Max that nothing else could. Some days, the progress was exhilarating. Max learned to laugh again, a sound that rippled through the house and seemed to scrub the walls clean. He smiled at Rosie and tried to mimic her barking, and the puppy would respond by nuzzling him or rolling onto her back, paws in the air. Therapists who visited shook their heads in wonder. "We're seeing real improvement," one said. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." But the hope was never simple. There were days when Max's energy vanished, when therapy ended in tears and frustration. Olivia would sit on the kitchen floor, head in her hands, struggling to fight back despair. Ben sometimes lost his temper, snapping at inanimate objects or simply disappearing into the backyard, needing a moment to himself. Margaret, too, faced her doubts. She would lie awake at night, listening to the wind outside, replaying every hard moment, afraid to let herself believe too much. Doctors reminded the family not to pin all their hopes on a few small movements. Progress is slow, the neurologist warned at a follow-up appointment. Sometimes it plateaus. Don't be discouraged if you hit setbacks. But for every warning, there were new sparks of hope. The therapists began writing more positive notes in Max's chart. Alert, engaged, reaching more, smiling. Rosie was now an official fixture in Max's medical file, the puppy's impact acknowledged by every professional who entered the house. Rosie's story spread beyond their block. Margaret wrote a heartfelt thank you note to the local newspaper, and soon neighbors began leaving treats and homemade dog toys on the porch. A group of children from down the street drew pictures of Rosie and Max, taping them to the mailbox in a colorful collage. Some people believed they were witnessing a miracle, while others shrugged, suggesting it was just luck or coincidence. But most everyone agreed. The house on Maple Lane had changed, and hope lived there now. With encouragement from therapists, Ben and Olivia agreed to try more challenging exercises. Rosie became Max's therapy partner, modeling crawling and stretching, even learning to wait patiently while Max worked with his legs. The bond between them deepened. Rosie's eyes rarely left Max, and Max responded to her with increasing confidence and affection. One afternoon, the family hosted a small gathering for the neighbors who had supported them. The living room was filled with laughter and the aroma of chocolate cake. Rosie wore a bright red ribbon, basking in the attention. As Max tried to reach for a slice of cake, Rosie gently nudged his arm, encouraging him to stretch a little further. The neighbors applauded, and for a moment, the room glowed with a sense of unity and shared triumph. But there were still hard days. After one grueling therapy session, Max lay exhausted and silent, refusing to look at anyone. Rosie lay beside him, licking his hand, but even she seemed subdued. Olivia, fighting tears, whispered, "Maybe it's too much. Maybe we're pushing him too hard." Margaret put an arm around her. "We're doing the best we can. He's not alone. None of us are." Some neighbors remained skeptical, muttering that miracles weren't real, that the family was just lucky. But Margaret didn't care. She saw the small victories, the way Rosie refused to give up, the way Max fought through every setback. She watched as Olivia's laughter returned, as Ben learned to hope again, as the whole house came back to life. Cards arrived from all over town, some wishing Max strength, others congratulating Rosie for being a hero. People sent treats, toys, and even homemade blankets. A local therapist offered a free group session, and the family found themselves surrounded by a web of support, cautious but genuine. Through it all, Rosie remained the heart of the family's recovery. She was Max's companion, Olivia's comfort, Ben's reason to smile, and Margaret's reminder that hope could find its way into even the darkest rooms. That night, as Rosie and Max drifted off to sleep, Margaret sat at the kitchen table writing in her journal. She reflected on the months since the storm, the setbacks, the miracles, and the small daily choices that had led them here. She realized that hope was not a single shining moment, but a series of tiny, stubborn decisions. And with Rosie by their side, she believed that anything was possible. Max's first birthday arrived on a clear spring morning, the sort of day that made even the ordinary feel miraculous. Sunlight slanted through the kitchen window, catching the edge of the frosted cake Olivia had spent all night decorating. Balloons bobbed gently in the air, their strings tied to chairs, and Margaret arranged paper plates with trembling, happy hands. For the first time in a long while, laughter felt easy in the Hayes home. Rosie pranced between guests, her tail wagging a mile a minute, basking in the extra attention. Neighbors stopped by in small groups, some with gifts for Max, some with homemade treats for Rosie, all wanting to share in this strange, hard-won happiness. Ben lifted Max from his chair and held him close to the window, pointing out the butterflies drifting over the flower beds. "Look at you, buddy," he said softly. "1 whole year old. You've come so far." But beneath the joy, a quiet anxiety hovered. Olivia caught Margaret's eye more than once, both of them silently acknowledging how delicate this piece was, how hard-earned, and how easily shattered. They hadn't spoken aloud the fear that something could still go wrong, but it lingered at the edge of every celebration. The doorbell rang late that afternoon, its cheerful chime oddly out of place in the middle of the laughter and clinking cups. Ben answered, expecting another neighbor, but instead found a stranger on the porch, a woman in her mid-30s, hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail, eyes rimmed red from crying. She held a faded photo in one hand, the other gripping her daughter's small palm. I'm sorry to barge in," the woman stammered, her voice trembling. "But I think you might have my dog. Her name is Bella. She's been missing since the storm last month." She held out the photo, her hand shaking. The living room fell silent. Rosie, who'd been gnawing on a squeaky toy at Max's feet, perked up, head cocked. At the sight of the woman and her daughter, she froze, nose twitching, then let out a low, uncertain whine. Olivia's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She took the photo, eyes darting between it and Rosie. The resemblance was undeniable. Same golden coat, same soulful eyes. Margaret stepped forward, her voice gentle but steady. "Please come inside. Let's talk." The woman introduced herself as Melissa and her daughter as Grace. "We lost everything in the storm, my job, our house, and Bella. She ran off during the worst of it. We've been looking for her every day since." Melissa's voice broke, and Grace squeezed her hand, silent but pleading. Rosie approached the pair cautiously, her tail wagging in hesitant little arcs. She sniffed at Melissa's hand, then sat down, looking back at Max as if seeking permission. The room was thick with emotion, relief, tension, fear of losing something precious all over again. Melissa's eyes filled with tears as Rosie nudged her knee. "You must have taken such good care of her. She looks so healthy, so happy." She glanced at Max, then back at Rosie, torn between the joy of finding her lost pet and the pain of seeing the bond that had formed here. "I'm so grateful you found her, but she's my daughter's dog. She's all we have left of our old life." Margaret shared Rosie's story, how she'd arrived during the worst storm, abandoned and shivering, and how she'd become Max's constant companion. Olivia described Rosie's impact, her heroism, the way she'd helped Max come back to life, her voice breaking with emotion. Ben played the baby monitor video of Rosie's rescue, the room falling silent as Melissa and Grace watched in awe. Grace spoke quietly, her eyes on Max. "She loves him. I can see it." Rosie moved closer to Max, settling protectively at his side, her body language clear. This was her family, too. The family and their guests waited, hardly daring to breathe. Melissa knelt down, meeting Rosie's gaze. "Bella, Rosie, you remember us, don't you?" Rosie licked her hand, but stayed rooted by Max's crib, looking from the woman to the boy, caught between two worlds. It was Grace who broke the tension, her voice small but certain. "Mom, maybe she's supposed to stay. Look how happy he is. We still love her, but Maybe, maybe she's their miracle now. Her words hung in the air, heavy with both loss and kindness. Tears streamed down Melissa's face as she hugged her daughter tightly. She looked at Margaret, her voice shaking. I just want her to be loved. That's all I ever wanted. The room relaxed, the moment's sharp edge softened by empathy and understanding. Melissa and Grace stayed for cake, sharing memories of Bella's playful puppy days. Rosie alternated between both families, her tail wagging tentatively, sensing the complicated love swirling in the room. As dusk fell and guests drifted home, Melissa hugged Olivia and Ben goodbye, promising to visit if they'd let her. Grace gave Rosie one last pat, whispering, "Thank you for being so brave." As the door closed behind them, Rosie returned to Max's side and curled up with a deep sigh, as if finally allowing herself to rest. Margaret stood at the window, watching the two families part ways on Maple Lane. She realized that the past had returned not to break them, but to ask for understanding, and somehow to give them all a chance at a different kind of healing. Inside, laughter and tears mingled, and the Hayes family held each other a little closer, grateful for the gift of Rosie and for the community that had carried them through. They knew the future was still uncertain, but they also knew one thing for sure. Love, once given, never really leaves. The morning after Max's birthday felt washed clean, sunlight spilling over Maple Lane and the front lawn still glittering with dew. Inside the Hayes home, an exhausted but peaceful quiet lingered, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Rosie stretched at the foot of Max's crib, blinking up at him with loving brown eyes, her golden tail thumping quietly. There was a sense that something had shifted, something important and lasting. Melissa and Grace returned that afternoon, their faces hopeful but uncertain. Margaret welcomed them in with a gentle smile, her voice steady even as her heart fluttered with anxiety. Ben and Olivia gathered in the living room, Max in Olivia's arms, Rosie planted firmly at his side. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air was thick with anticipation. Two families joined by fate, love, and a storm, all waiting for an answer none of them had been prepared to give. Melissa broke the silence first. "I barely slept last night," she admitted, her words raw. "I kept thinking about Bella, Rosie, about what she means to you and to us. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to just take her home, to have back what we lost, but..." She looked at Max, then at her daughter. "Sometimes love asks us to let go." Grace stood next to her, clutching the same faded photograph she'd brought the day before. Her eyes shone with maturity far beyond her years. "I know Rosie remembers us, but she loves Max now. I saw it yesterday. Maybe she's needed here." Ben squeezed Olivia's hand, his jaw tight with emotion. Olivia looked at Melissa and Grace, her own eyes brimming. "We never meant to take her from you. When we found her, she was so scared, so lost. She saved Max's life. She saved all of us in a way. But if you want her back..." Melissa shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I want her to be happy, that's all. And I can see she's happy here. I can see you love her as much as we did." Grace stepped forward and gently scratched Rosie's ear, her hand trembling. "Just promise to take care of her forever," she whispered. Margaret's heart ached as she watched Rosie press her nose into Grace's palm, then return immediately to Max's side. The choice was heartbreaking but beautiful, a selfless act from a family that had already lost so much. It was Ben who offered the olive branch. "Rosie will always have a place in your lives. You can visit her any time, and you'll always be part of her story." Olivia nodded, her gratitude spilling over. Thank you both of you for trusting us. We'll never forget what you've given us. As word spread through the neighborhood about Melissa's decision, the community, already invested in the story of Max and Rosie, rallied to celebrate this new beginning. Mrs. Cummings, who lived across the street, suggested a block party. Within hours, plans were underway. Strings of colorful banners, tables set up with cookies and lemonade, music drifting through open windows. Kids ran up and down the block, eager to play with Rosie and to cheer for Max. At the party, Rosie wore a bright blue bandana embroidered with her name and the word hero. Max, propped up in his stroller, beamed with pride as Rosie sat beside him, soaking in every head pat and ear scratch. Neighbors stopped to hear the story, how a lost puppy, a storm, and a family's heartbreak had come together to create something like a miracle. A reporter from the local paper arrived, snapping photos and jotting down notes. The story quickly became the talk of the town. Miracle dog saves local boy. Community unites in hope. People who'd never met the Hayes family before dropped by to leave cards, stuffed animals, and even donations for Max's therapy. The party was more than a celebration. It was a collective sigh of relief, a signal that hope had returned to Maple Lane. Margaret found herself at the center of a cluster of parents and children, sharing Rosie's journey. One mother, whose son struggled with anxiety, asked if Rosie could visit their home sometime. Another neighbor, recently widowed, wiped away tears as she listened. "Sometimes we just need something to believe in again," she said softly. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. Rosie was officially welcomed as the neighborhood's therapy dog, and Olivia was invited to start a weekly story time at the local library, bringing Rosie along to comfort other children and seniors. Margaret offered to help, her spirit rekindled by the joy and connection she saw blossoming all around. But the most profound change was in Max. With Rosie's love and the community's encouragement, he continued to surprise everyone. Therapy sessions became moments of celebration, not just struggle. Even when progress was slow, there was always Rosie's tail wagging, a neighbor cheering him on, a new friend made at every turn. The Hayes family, once isolated by pain and worry, found themselves embraced by a network of care. The block party became a tradition, an annual reminder that even in the face of loss, love and hope could grow. As the sun set on the celebration, Ben scooped Max into his arms, Rosie trotting faithfully at their heels. The air buzzed with laughter, children's shouts, and the steady hum of possibility. Margaret lingered for a moment on the porch, looking out at the lantern-lit street, her heart full. She understood, in that quiet, golden hour, that miracles weren't just thunderclaps or sudden healings. Sometimes they arrived as a gentle decision, a selfless act, a community opening its arms. And as Rosie curled up at Max's feet that night, the Hayes family knew their story was no longer just about loss or even just about survival. It was about the extraordinary power of kindness, about opening doors and hearts again and again until hope moved in to stay. The weeks that followed the block party unfolded gently, like petals opening after a storm. Summer's heat rolled in over Dayton, and with it came long afternoons of golden sunlight, laughter from the neighborhood, and moments of deep, quiet reflection in the Hayes house. But beneath the surface, the family felt the shifting currents of everything they'd survived. Pain, loss, unexpected grace, and now the steady hum of hope. One evening, after dinner dishes were stacked, and Max and Rosie had finally fallen asleep side by side, Margaret slipped out to the backyard. The sky was a soft violet, fireflies drifting lazily above the grass. Margaret sat in her favorite old lawn chair, the one she'd rescued from a yard sale the summer Ben was born, and breathed in the warm air. She let her mind drift backward, first to the day of the storm, the hospital's harsh fluorescent lights, Olivia's haunted silence, Ben's numb disbelief. She remembered how helpless she'd felt, the terror that threatened to swallow her as she watched her son and his wife splinter under the weight of Max's diagnosis. She remembered the nights spent praying in the dark, the prayers sometimes bitter, sometimes desperate, sometimes nothing more than a whispered plea. Let him be okay. Let us survive this. Margaret reached for the mug of tea she'd brought outside, letting the warmth anchor her to the present. She watched as Rosie, now a beloved fixture, twitched in her sleep beside Max's stroller on the porch. It struck her how much had changed, and how much hadn't. The fear was still there, but it had softened, woven through with gratitude. The pain, too, lingered at the edges, a reminder that healing didn't erase scars. It only made them bearable. She thought of the setbacks, the therapy sessions that ended in tears, the slow days when progress seemed to halt, the nights Olivia cried alone in the kitchen, the anger Ben tried and failed to hide. There were moments when the house felt heavy again, hope dimming beneath the reality of Max's challenges and the world's casual cruelty. Margaret remembered the way some neighbors doubted, the way a few people quietly wondered if it was all luck or worse, a story made bigger by desperation. And she thought of her own regrets, the times she'd snapped at Ben, or avoided Olivia's gaze because she was afraid her own sorrow might make things worse. She remembered feeling invisible, old, useless in the face of her family's suffering. But Rosie had changed that. The little dog's presence had pulled Margaret back from her own despair, had taught her that showing up, even when she felt powerless, mattered. Margaret's gaze drifted upward, following the path of a lone firefly as it zigzagged toward the fence. She realized that Rosie's gift hadn't just been in what she'd done for Max, though that alone felt like a miracle. The real transformation had happened in the slow, ordinary moments. Rosie sleeping at Margaret's feet on long nights, nudging a toy into Ben's hands after a hard day, licking Olivia's face until she laughed through her tears. Healing, Margaret now understood, was a communal thing. It grew not from dramatic moments, but from the patient accumulation of ordinary kindnesses, the willingness to show up, to listen, to keep loving when love felt impossible. She remembered something her mother once told her, long before Ben was born. Miracles aren't always thunderbolts. Sometimes they're just the stubbornness to keep trying. Margaret smiled, the memory softening her face. That, she thought, was Rosie in a nutshell, a small, trembling puppy, determined to love them all the way back to hope. Back inside, Ben and Olivia sat together in the dim light of the living room, Max asleep in Olivia's lap, Rosie at his feet. Ben glanced at his wife, then at his mother as she stepped quietly through the door. "You okay, Mom?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "I am, sweetheart. I really am." She sat beside them, her heart full but at peace. Olivia leaned her head on Ben's shoulder. "I don't think I ever believed we'd get here," she whispered. "I thought the pain would swallow us whole." Ben took her hand. "I did too. But then Rosie came and I don't know. She didn't fix everything. But she made it easier to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could be a family again." Margaret looked at them. Her son, her daughter-in-law, her grandson, and the dog that had saved them all. She realized the lesson she wanted to remember, the one she hoped Max would grow up knowing. True miracles were ordinary. They were stitched together from steadfastness, from loving each other in darkness and in light. The next morning, as the sun crept through the windows and Rosie leaped onto Max's bed with a happy bark, Margaret felt only gratitude. There would still be hard days, still be nights of worry and setbacks. But the family had learned to weather storms together and to look for the light, no matter how faint, until it became enough. As she poured herself a fresh cup of tea, Margaret reflected on the journey. Not perfect, not without scars, but utterly real. She knew, deep down, that the miracle was not only in Max's improvement or Rosie's devotion, but in the way the family and their community had chosen hope day after day, even when hope seemed impossibly far away. Months slipped by in gentle succession, and the shadows of the storm receded into memory. Summer mellowed into a soft, golden fall. Maple Lane's trees turned fire-bright, and the breeze was full of the scent of leaves and distant wood smoke. On one perfect Saturday, the Hayes family gathered at Riverside Park, a new family tradition. Blankets spread over the grass, a thermos of coffee, and a lunchbox filled with peanut butter sandwiches and apple slices. Rosie led the way, bounding ahead, her fur shining in the sunlight, nose twitching at every falling leaf. Max sat in the middle of the blanket, stronger now, his laughter ringing out across the park. His legs still refused to cooperate the way other children's did, but his arms were steady, his hands quick and sure. Rosie sprawled next to him, her head in his lap, content to watch the clouds and the families wandering by. Margaret sat beside them, her knitting needles clicking quietly, her heart brimming with contentment she'd once feared would never return. Olivia and Ben relaxed nearby, sharing a rare moment of ease. They watched Max and Rosie with the deep, quiet gratitude that comes from surviving the unthinkable. Every milestone, every laugh, every movement, every day with their son felt hard-won, a gift earned and cherished. It wasn't a miracle in the storybook sense, Margaret thought, but it was a miracle all the same. Rosie had become more than a pet. She was now a part of the community's story, a living symbol of hope and tenacity. Each week, Margaret and Olivia brought Rosie to the local nursing home, where she curled up at the feet of lonely seniors, coaxing smiles from faces that rarely saw visitors. At the public library, story time with Rosie had become a cherished event. Children gathered in a circle, listening to tales of courage and kindness, their hands buried in Rosie's soft fur, their worries forgotten for a little while. Margaret watched the ripples Rosie created, how a single act of love, a single life, could spread outwards, touching people she would never meet. Parents whose children struggled with illness or fear found comfort in Max's journey. Strangers dropped off treats for Rosie at the Hayes porch, or left notes of encouragement for Max. Even the skeptical neighbors who once doubted now stopped to greet the dog who had changed so much and to share a smile or a kind word. The story of Max and Rosie was shared in articles, community newsletters, and even a local TV segment. But for Margaret, the truest version of their story played out in small, everyday moments. The slow progress in therapy, Rosie's quiet companionship, the ways the family had learned to care for each other in their darkest hours. One afternoon, Margaret sat in the backyard with Max, while Rosie chased a butterfly near the fence. She found herself reflecting on the legacy they were building, one not made of grand gestures, but of small, steadfast choices. She thought of the pain that had once ruled their days, the hospital, the diagnosis, the isolation, and how those wounds had been slowly stitched over by the gentle persistence of love. She thought about the lesson she most wanted to pass on, that miracles are rarely dramatic or immediate. They arrive as quiet gifts, an outstretched hand, a nudge of encouragement, the faith to try again after failure. She had learned, in her own bones, that the greatest changes happen not with thunderclaps but in the steady, everyday acts of hope. Max, growing more independent each week, began to insist on pushing his own wheelchair across the grass, Rosie trotting faithfully beside him. He called out to another child across the park, waving a toy in the air. His laughter was free, his joy unburdened by all he'd endured. Olivia wiped a tear from her cheek, pride and gratitude mingling in her smile. As the afternoon faded and families packed up their blankets, Margaret stayed behind a little longer, watching Max and Rosie under the wide Ohio sky. She knew their journey would always be imperfect. There would be more challenges, more setbacks, more nights spent worrying or remembering the pain. But the family was no longer defined by what they had lost. Instead, they were united by the daily, ordinary decision to hope. Before they left, Ben snapped a picture. Max, grinning with Rosie pressed against his side, Margaret's arm around them both. The image captured not just a day in the park, but the slow, miraculous unfolding of their lives since that first storm. The way love, chosen and shared, had carried them through. In the following weeks, Margaret and Rosie continued their volunteer visits. Rosie became a fixture not just in the Hayes home, but in the lives of children and seniors all over town. The families who'd once reached out for hope now paid it forward, forming a web of kindness that held the community together in good times and bad. Late one evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the house quiet except for Rosie's gentle breathing and the faint hum of the refrigerator. She opened her journal and wrote, "Sometimes hope arrives as a storm, sometimes as a small, trembling puppy. But it always asks us to open our door again and again until healing begins. The world doesn't need perfect families or perfect endings. It needs people who refuse to stop loving, even when loving is hard. That's the gift we've been given. That's what I want Max to remember, long after the story of Rosie becomes legend." With that, she closed her journal, let her hand rest on Rosie's head, and smiled. For tonight, all was well. Their story was not about one miracle, but about the courage to keep choosing hope, and the understanding that the greatest legacies are built quietly, day after day, through resilience, compassion, and ordinary love. As Rosie snuggled closer, Margaret knew their journey would inspire others, families carrying invisible burdens, lonely hearts in need of comfort, children and elders seeking a reason to believe. Their lives had been changed forever by a single, trembling puppy and the storm she rode in on. And now, as the future stretched out before them, uncertain, imperfect, but undeniably full of promise, the Hayes family was finally, beautifully whole.